Good morning, Highlands Presbyterian. So today is the third sermon in a series of 4 about the historical reliability of the Gospels and how we know we can trust what we read in the Gospels when it talks about the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And we're talking about books today. And I love to read. In 2011, I started recording every book and how many pages I read, likely driven by the fact that we were about to have our first child, and I realized that with sleep deprivation, my memory was probably going to get a little fuzzy, but it's fascinating to look back and see all the books that I've read. I average about 40 books a year, and it sort of comes and goes in waves. I'll have months where I read 5 or 6 books, and then I'll have months where I don't read any. I generally don't read books more than once, with the exception of The Count of Monte Cristo, which is, in my belief, the best fictional work of all time, although I implore you never watch any of the cinematic portrayals of it. I've seen them all, and I don't think any of them are close to the story. I read a lot of fiction. It's lovely to escape into another world, even if only for a few hours. Fiction doesn't ask anything of me. It just invites me on an adventure, one that costs nothing, and I love that, just getting lost in this other world for a little while. And there's fiction books everywhere. In the last 12 months, 19 million romance novels were published. Not my genre, but a lot of books out there, and constantly new books coming out. And it's hard to imagine a world without fiction books where both the author and the reader know the story isn't real. When I pick up a mystery novel, I'm not under any illusion that it actually happened. It's not created to deceive, but it's created to entertain. And this type of literature was thought to be invented somewhere around the 12th century. Before that, there were stories. But these are epic poems or myths that try to explain something about the universe, try to explain something about life. And some biographies as well. But the Gospels were a new type of literature at the time. They were biographies, but they were intertwined with theology too. They didn't simply tell us about the life of Jesus, but they focused on his teachings too. As Luke says in the introduction to his gospel, he did some research. There were a number of people trying to compile a record of Jesus' ministry, and Luke wanted to know the truth. He wanted to grant certainty to those who were curious, to those who had some knowledge. He didn't set out to tell a story for entertainment. He set out on a research project to try and figure out what was true. He had followed things closely, had talked to eyewitnesses, and what he writes down is what he can figure out is true and reliable. And it's fascinating to me, but when you read the story, and some people will say, hey, these are just fictional stories, they are made up. But when you read them, it's not a story that someone would make up. It's so far from that. When you think about hero stories and the myths of that day and even of today, the hero always wins. Think about the founders of other religions. They come out victorious in the end. That's how good stories end. Just like our fiction today. When you think about a movie, there's always a scene where the hero is beaten down and it looks like they're about to lose, and then all of a sudden they rise up and they conquer. If we were talking about the Christianity in this way, if we were going to tell a story that we wanted to be commercially successful and popular, Jesus, when he was on the cross, when this Roman was about to stick a spear into his side, he'd grab the spear at the last minute, he'd kill the Roman soldier, he'd climb off the cross and lead a revolt and kick the Romans out of Jerusalem. And that's what people were expecting, and that's what would sell. There'd be this great score behind it at the end of the movie. Everybody would be cheering. The hero at the point of death rallies the team to victory. That's what good fiction does. And it's the opposite of what happens in the Gospels. And the story that Luke tells, the story that Mark tells, that Matthew tells, that John tells, that Paul tells, is one where the hero doesn't win. The hero of the story is defeated on the cross. The Roman Empire wins. The world goes dark for 3 days. And then he comes back from the dead. But then he turns around and leaves again. And at the end of the Gospels, Rome is still in power. The disciples seem confused. Not much appears to have changed. Is this a story that can change the world? Not unless there's a supernatural force behind it. And look at the disciples. The people who tell the story. They don't place themselves in a good light, which you wouldn't do if you were going to make it up. You'd make yourself look better. Remember who Jesus says is going to be the leader of the church? That's Peter. He's the guy who comes out looking worst of all, except for Judas. Peter tells Jesus to his face that he's ready to go to prison, that he's ready to die before he would deny Jesus. And that promise itself dies on the very same day when a teenage girl asks Peter if he even knows Jesus. Peter wilts under pressure, and that's recorded in the Gospels. The Gospel of Mark is largely thought to have Peter as the primary source. And in Mark's Gospel, it's reported that Peter denies Jesus and then curses him. If you were Peter, would you tell that story? Or would you maybe omit that part? And, when people asked you what you were doing when Jesus was on trial, you'd say that you were trying to get there and trying to break in but couldn't find a way. You wouldn't share that you denied Jesus. You'd pray no one ever found out that you cursed Jesus. There's so many things that point to the Gospels as reliable sources of what happened because they're so different than any other type of literature or the way anybody else would write a story. In Mark's Gospel, in chapter 14, Jesus is being arrested and the disciples are fleeing. And in verse 51, we're told there's a young man wearing nothing but a linen cloth. And the soldiers grab the linen cloth, and the young man is so desperate to save his own skin that he wriggles out of the cloth and runs away naked. Everyone assumes that this is Mark's autobiographical note. And in a culture where to be seen naked is the height of shame, would you want that recorded, that you were so desperate to get away from Jesus and save your own skin that you left your clothes behind and ran off naked? Of course you wouldn't. And then all of these disciples that fled for their own lives, they later died to be associated with Jesus. Even when Jesus wasn't there anymore, they were willingly subjected to painful and brutal deaths. The same people who fled for their lives at the thought of even being arrested before they knew Jesus would be convicted. Why? What changed? Something would have had to have changed. Something remarkable. Something unprecedented. Something supernatural. Something like seeing a man come back from the dead. Seeing someone more powerful than death. Something like that would give them the belief that there's an undercurrent in the universe that resonates with a grace so powerful, so unlike anything you've ever come across, that the very God who hung the stars in the sky is offering you forgiveness and has told you that that God is more powerful than death itself. You'd have to be able to cling to something like that, to not only tell a story that you might get killed for, but tell a story in which you looked terrible. But suddenly, you don't care what society thinks about you because the God who's more powerful than death has claimed you and demonstrated to you that there's a future for you other than the one that you thought was always there for your whole life. Where maybe you thought things ended at death. Suddenly you've been shown a different reality, a greater reality. And so you're not worried. You're willing to tell a story in which you look bad because you have been affirmed that you are claimed by God and that your glory doesn't rest in your personal success or failure, but rather it rests in Jesus Christ. And you believe that so firmly that you'll go tell a story and you'll tell one in which you look weak because that invites other people to come and rely on Jesus Christ. You're not embarrassed. You're free to write things as they are, even if it paints you in a terrible light. You believe the impossible is possible because you've seen and talked to witnesses who saw a man rise from the grave. So what would make you afraid? You're not afraid. You're not ashamed, and so you tell the story, even with the very worst scenes in it, because it's a demonstration of God's power, and you're clinging to that power. Because it's all you need. You don't need anything else. You don't need the world's approval because you have God's. What does it matter if someone else in the world thinks less of you? The God who tells the stars to shine has said you are beloved and treasured forever. And that's more than enough. So you tell God's story. This is one of the puzzle pieces that help us know that the Gospels are true. That the men seem to have invented a type of literature that wasn't seen before, that disappeared after they died, unlike other types of literature. And the stories aren't like stories that are written today, and they spare no details telling us the faults and the failures of the main characters. They share the most embarrassing details of the people who are supposed to know the most. And then at the most important part of the story, the part they'd want everyone else in society to believe, they bring in, as primary witnesses, characters whose testimony wouldn't be accepted in a court of law. All of the Gospels place women at the tomb as the first witnesses. And in the first century, the testimony of women was not accepted in the courts. And so why would they do that unless that's the way that it happened? Women were the faithful witnesses. Peter was redeemed. Mark was welcomed back into the community. Jesus really did rise from the dead. What other explanation is there? Others have been offered, but I find them all unconvincing. Luke didn't set out to write a fictional story. Peter didn't die for a tall tale. Paul didn't travel around and meet eyewitnesses of Jesus Christ and allow himself to be beheaded because he thought it was a fictional story that was fun to tell. All of them did the research and passed along what they knew to be true. And because of the words that they've assembled, we can have confidence that it's true. We can have the same certainty that Luke was attempting to give to Theophilus, so that our faith can be a firm and strong foundation. And we might not be ashamed of anything, but recognize that God can use any of us no matter what, because the glory doesn't rest in us, but in what Christ has done for us. So we don't have to be afraid of our failures, but rather we can invite people in and say, I failed, and even if you failed too, there's room for you in this community. Thanks be to God.